an interesting, sorry, the recording message came up, a really interesting and fun forum for review and discussion of the latest publications in the field of survey methodology and public opinion research with those who wrote the book. So in the old days, we may have met in person in a more intimate environment, maybe somewhere in DC, gone out for lunch, but then we would not have been able to give a warm DC-AAPOR welcome to our first book club guest speaker, Professor Peter Lynn, who is currently at an undisclosed location somewhere in the south of England. And we would also not have been able to welcome those of you who are located outside the DMV. So welcome and thank you for joining today. In any case, we've tried to make the session less formal and more personable. So with that in mind, we're using Zoom meeting rather than webinars. So you'll be able to actually ask your questions and make observations yourself with Professor Lynn, or actually with each other as the discussion gets underway. So I'll ask you to mute your microphones when you're not speaking, but if you feel comfortable turning on your camera during the Q&A, we can try and capture some of that more intimate in-person feeling. And I should say a big thank you to the DC-AAPOR Executive Council, who've made it possible for a lucky DC-AAPOR member to win a copy of the books that we feature in these sessions. And Andy Zuckerberg, who's the DC-AAPOR president, will announce today's book winner at the end of the session. So I'll kick off by introducing Professor Peter Lynn, who we are really honored to welcome today. Peter is editor and co-author of a Wiley publication from earlier this year, Advances in Longitudinal Survey Methodology, which he'll be talking about today. Peter is director of the Institute for Social and Economic Research at the University of Essex in the UK, where he is also holds a professorial chair in survey methodology. He previously worked at the National Centre for Social Research and has 35 years experience in survey methods and statistics. Peter was the founding editor of the journal Survey Research Methods and one of the founding committee members of the European Survey Research Association, ESRA. He's previously served as Vice President and President of the International Association of Survey Statisticians. And since moving to the University of Essex some 20 years ago, he's worked primarily on the British Household Panel Survey and his successor, Understanding Society, the UK Household Longitudinal Study, of which he is co-investigator. So without further ado, I'll hand you over to Peter.
Thank you, Amanda, for that introduction, though it does make me feel a bit old. And you've also set a bit of a challenge by suggesting that this might be interesting and fun, but we shall see. But I am very grateful for the invitation. As you will hear in a minute, this book has been a large part of my life for about 5 years until it was published in March this year. And you know, when it was published, I just kind of sighed a big sigh of relief. And then, you know, I got a few congratulations emails and things like that. But since about April, I haven't really thought about it at all. I haven't looked at it. And this invitation to come and speak here today has just kind of given me an opportunity with a little bit of a break to reflect on the book itself and the process. So I am really grateful. I hope this is going to be of some interest. Can I just check, Amanda? Can you see my screen fine? Good, thank you. So this is the book I'm going to be talking about. And you know, I've never attended a book club, let alone spoken at a book club before. So it suddenly occurred to me last week when I had to prepare something to present. So I didn't really know what you expected of me. What I've decided to do is to talk about 3 things, which we might think of as the why, the how, and the what of the book. So the why is, why did I decide to produce this book? How did it come about? I hope that might be of some interest to some of you. The second part is then to talk about the process. How did I go about producing the book? What does the process involve? Some of you will know about editing books already, some of you might not. And then finally, I'm going to end up by talking about the actual contents of the book, what's in it, and who is it for. So that's the plan for the next 25 minutes or so. Now, in order to talk a bit about the background of this book, I need to start by kind of delving into history a bit. Longitudinal surveys have been around for quite a while, but not for as long as surveys as a whole. And it wasn't really until the 1980s that they started getting regularly treated separately in survey methodology circles. And this culminated with a symposium which appropriately was held in Washington, DC in 1986 on the methodology of panel surveys. The invited presentations from that symposium became chapters in the well-known 1989 book published by Wiley, edited by Dan Kasperczyk and others, called Panel Surveys. And that really, for many years, was the only publication devoted specifically to issues that affect longitudinal or panel surveys. I moved to Essex about 20 years ago, as Amanda kindly said, and found myself working on a longitudinal survey and focusing solely on longitudinal survey methods. And with this book, the Panel Surveys book, pretty much the only one in the field at that time, it kind of felt to me as if we could do better as a field and we could produce something a bit more up to date and a bit broader in terms of coverage of the methodology of longitudinal surveys. So I made a proposal to run a conference in 2006, which took place at Essex, called the International Conference on the Methodology of Longitudinal Surveys. And we turned all the invited chapters, all the invited presentations from that conference into chapters in this book you can see that was published in 2009, Methodology of Longitudinal Surveys. So that's the history. What happened slightly more recently was about 10 years or so after the 2006 conference, when I was just about recovering from that experience, I finally had my arm twisted to make a proposal to hold a follow-up conference. So that was in 2016. The idea was accepted by my colleagues at Essex, and the plan was to hold this conference 2 years later in 2018. So I then submitted a book proposal to Wiley. And fortunately for me, they accepted that, despite the fact that I couldn't tell them who any of the chapter authors were going to be or what any of the chapters were going to be about. Somehow they still thought this was a good idea. So we went ahead with the idea. And you can see then from this sort of timeline in front of you that the basic process of producing the book took about 3 years, starting from a call for papers in April 2017 through to final submission of the complete manuscript in May 2020 to Wiley. So that's a kind of 3-year process, and overall 5 years if you think about from the original proposal until actual publication. So the main event in this timeline was the conference itself, which was held very successfully again at the University of Essex in July 2018. Most of the rest of the time was spent with reviewing draft chapters, sending them back for revisions to chapter authors, and so on. There were also some additional tasks involved in producing the book, beyond simply inviting the submissions and reviewing them. As an editor, you have to do things like write the index, which was a bit of a challenge. That's not an easy thing to do. It's a book with, I've forgotten how many pages, 600 and something. It's a lot of text to scan through and figure what to put in the index. But that's basically the timeline. Now you might think, well, okay, most of that is just reviewing papers. And if you've seen the book, well, it only has 20 chapters. So it's like reviewing 20 papers over the course of 2 or 3 years. Well, yes and no. When you review a paper for a journal, you're basically being asked to review the scientific content of something that's already been written. And yes, you have to do that with book chapters as well, but that's not all you have to do. The editor's task starts earlier than that. I certainly tried to shape the content and the focus of each chapter. So when the initial proposals were submitted for papers that would become chapters, these were just abstracts of 2 or 3 paragraphs. And I spent a lot of time kind of trying to persuade and cajole certain authors to refocus their chapter in a slightly different way, to make it fit in better with other chapters, to fit in with the ethos of the book, and so on. So there's this initial stage of trying to shape the content. Then there's the ongoing review of the scientific content as soon as the first draft is received. And then there's a bunch of additional things that you have to do with a book that you wouldn't do if you were just reviewing a single paper for a journal. I tried quite hard to achieve consistency of things like terminology and ideas between the chapters of the book, so that readers won't get confused by seeing different chapter authors referring to the same thing in different ways, or saying contradictory things even, things like that. So as editor, you have to keep your eye on the detail of the content of all of the chapters, keeping in mind what other people have written in other chapters. Avoiding duplication. You know, we have some chapters that are on closely related topics, or topics that are in the same area of survey methodology. So there was a risk that these chapters would end up with, you know, each having an overview of that area as their first section. And there's no need to have 3 separate overviews of the same area. So I tried to ensure that one of the chapters would have the overview, the other 2 would refer back to that chapter for the overview, that kind of thing. Then, of course, it's necessary to chase authors who are tardy in submitting their drafts, to remind them of deadlines and so on. There's quite a lot of that nitty-gritty that goes on. And there's also quite a lot of what I would call rather basic editing, improving the language, improving the grammar, correcting spelling, and just making the whole thing as easily readable as possible. I've already mentioned producing an index as one of these additional tasks. I was also asked to supply an image for the cover, which was not something I was expecting, so I had to quickly knock something up. And I actually drew that little graph that appears on the cover. I'm sure somebody else could have done a much better job, but there you go. So that's just a little bit about the process that I hope may have been insightful to some of you. What's actually in the book? Well, a good place to start is perhaps with this little quote. The top quote on the slide here is taken from the book proposal that I submitted to Wiley all those years ago. My vision for the book was that it would provide a comprehensive overview of the many advances that have been made in the field of longitudinal survey methodology over the past 12 years or so. In other words, since the previous conference and the previous book. Clearly, during that time, quite a lot had happened. A lot of new longitudinal surveys had started and become established. But also the previous book, the 2009 book, if you flick through it, you'll find quite a lot of chapters are somewhat devoid of empirical evidence on a particular topic. They're kind of an overview of the current state of the art. This is what we know about the topic. This is how we currently handle it in survey design and implementation. But wouldn't it be great if we also knew whether it worked better to do it this way or that way, that kind of stuff. So to some extent, the 2009 book was setting a bit of a research agenda in some areas, pointing out what we knew and what we didn't know about survey methodology specific to longitudinal surveys. And I think, at risk of sounding slightly immodest, I think that book did help to kickstart some methodological research over the following years. So by the time 10 or 12 years have gone by, we knew quite a lot more about some of the issues that were covered in that first book, because a lot of methodological research had been carried out. In addition to which, as I said, there were new surveys that had come along, many of which had carried out their own testing and development work to help them make design decisions. So all of that provided a much larger body of knowledge about longitudinal survey methods than had existed back in 2006. And there were also some topics that were just not covered in the earlier book. I mean, you can't cover everything in one book, but some things, you know, only emerged later. We have, for example, a couple of chapters about biomarkers in the recent book, the one that came out this year. There were hardly any longitudinal surveys collecting biomarkers back in 2006, so it's not really surprising that there wasn't anything on that in the first book. So that was kind of the vision, was to update and to broaden the topic coverage of the earlier volume. Now, the call for papers that we issued suggested that chapters should provide an overview of current knowledge on a particular topic and or important new research that provides theoretical or empirical insights. So kind of imagine these two different types of chapters, the overview or the important new research. And the focus was to be on issues that are specific to the context of longitudinal data collection. So clearly there are a lot of issues that affect all surveys, including longitudinal surveys. Those are not the ones that we were trying to attract to this book. It's the ones that are particularly, that are specific to the context of repeatedly collecting information from the same people. There are things like panel attrition, measurement where you can take advantage of or be influenced by previous participation, those kinds of things. So that was the vision for the content of the book. What we ended up with is a book of 20 chapters, and the book itself doesn't have any explicit structure. It's not divided into sections, but you can kind of see a structure if you look at the contents page. The first couple of chapters are about broad design issues. There are then a set of chapters that are about issues to do with respondent participation. Another set of chapters that are about measurement issues, and finally, some chapters on analysis issues. So that's kind of the implicit structure of the book. And just to give you a flavor of some of the kind of things, I'm not going to talk about every chapter in the book, there isn't time to do that, but just to give you a flavor, I thought I would compare this book with the previous volume, the 2009 one. So I've already mentioned that there are some topics covered now that were not before. Biomarkers is one of them. Another one at the bottom of the list here is supplemental studies. Now we've got 2 chapters on supplemental studies, both of which actually are focusing on the effects of mounting a supplemental study on the longitudinal survey on subsequent attrition. And I guess the reason that this focus has become an important one for many people over the last decade or so is simply because so many longitudinal studies have become established, shown themselves to be successful. And once that happens, questions start getting asked, well, can't we also do this with that study? Can't we also mount this side study and use it as a tool for collecting more information? So there have been many proposals to run supplemental studies on longitudinal surveys, some of which have come to fruition, and these studies have actually happened. One of the concerns with doing that is, yes, it's great to take advantage of all the value of the study being in place, but is there a risk that we'll be overburdening some sample members and causing them to not want to continue, or possibly kind of breaking the contract that we had with them? We said it was going to be, a repeated survey with this kind of structure and this kind of content, but suddenly we're actually asking them to do something different, additional, that we never mentioned earlier on, and so on. So that's perhaps why these 2 chapters are focusing on the effects on attrition, because that's a relatively new concern in the field. Some of the other issues covered in the book are things that were there before, but the focus has changed. So there was one chapter on data linkage in the 2009 book, and this was one of those that was really an overview of all the issues that you need to think about if you're considering data linkage on a longitudinal survey as opposed to a cross-sectional survey. And a lot of those issues were things that nobody really had much experience of yet back in 2006 when that conference took place. That's changed a lot. There are now several longitudinal surveys that regularly engage in linkage to various kinds of other data. Consequently, we've ended up with 3 chapters on the topic in the more recent book. There are clearly many research teams for whom this is an issue. And as it happens, all 3 of those chapters largely, or even entirely, focus on respondent consent as an issue. Sorry, didn't mean to do that. So that's obviously perceived as being one of the big issues with data linkage, is how you get consent, what the consent means in a longitudinal context. Do you have to ask the question again repeatedly? Are you trying to link longitudinal data, which means linking more than once, and so on, and what implications that has. So that's quite a lot of new knowledge about consent in the longitudinal context that really could not have been included in the earlier book because the knowledge wasn't there at that time. Modes is another issue that has clearly increased in salience over these years. There was just a single chapter in the earlier book which focused on changing modes over time. The idea that if you had a longitudinal survey, it was probably a single mode survey, but you might at some point want to consider converting it to a different mode. That was what people were thinking about back in 2006. Since then, an awful lot of longitudinal surveys have either gone mixed mode or are considering going mixed mode. And it's certainly the mixed mode context that is of main interest at the moment, rather than shifting from one single mode to another. So we've got 3 chapters on modes, and they are, as I said, mainly focused on the mixed mode context, but different aspects of it. Some are about the influence on measurement, some are about practicalities of setting up mixed mode longitudinal surveys, and so on. Respondent tracking or tracing is another big issue with longitudinal surveys. We had a chapter, an excellent chapter on that in the earlier book by Mick Cooper and Mary Beth Ofstedal, where they basically proposed a framework for thinking about the issues in terms of how you deal with tracking respondents, but with a focus particularly on the idea that it's when people move home that you run the risk of losing them. And actually the chapter is about, well, when somebody actually does move home, what do you do about it? So it's reactive tracking. You find that a respondent isn't where you thought they were, what do you do? The chapter that we have in the more recent book reflects, I think, sort of changing thinking over the last decade or two, that longitudinal surveys now tend to think far more holistically about respondent participation throughout the lifetime of the survey. So it's all about how you get participants engaged from the beginning and keep them engaged and make them kind of feel that they would proactively want to tell you when their contact details change and that kind of thing. So that's the focus of the chapter that we have this time. Okay, weighting is the other thing that's on the chart. I mean, again, this is just an example. There was a single chapter in the earlier book that was just describing the current state of the art in weighting for household panel surveys. The range of surveys that have started or have changed their nature over the last decade or more means that lots of new issues in weighting have been thrown up over this time. And of course, there are also now new methods for dealing with some of those issues that just weren't well developed a while ago. So the chapter that we have now is a kind of overview of the issues that are faced and the approaches that are used. And to some extent, parts of this chapter are more like chapters that were in the earlier book. So there are a lot of unanswered questions in there. And I think this chapter is one that's trying to set the research agenda for things that we're not really sure which is the best way to do things. So hopefully that's given you some idea of the content. I don't have time to sort of dwell on all the individual chapters, but I'm just going to flash them up in front of you. So these are the first 10 chapters, and then there's another 10. And that's basically it, I think. I've given you kind of an overview of the production of the book and what's in it. I'm going to leave it to you to tell me what else you would have liked me to talk about. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Peter. That was absolutely marvellous. And we're now open for questions. So again, feel free to turn your cameras on. Do mute yourself when you're not speaking, but raise your hand if you'd like to ask a question or make a comment, and I will attempt to notice you. If I don't notice you, send me a note through chat or just jump in and speak. But if you could just give your name and affiliation, that would be really helpful. So does anyone have anything that they like to actually ask Peter directly related to the discussion? Peter, maybe if you stop sharing the screen, then that way I could get.
Sure.
See everybody.
Just wanted to leave it there for a moment.
Anyone have any questions? They like Darby. Do you want to go ahead?
Hi, thank you so much, Peter. I'm curious about anything you're seeing with the impact of COVID on longitudinal surveys. What we found was obviously we had to move longitudinal surveys over to phone that might have traditionally been face-to-face longitudinal. And now that we're going back to the possibility of being face-to-face, are you seeing that people want to keep going in the mode that they used during COVID, for example, phone, and anything about the introduction of CAVI or computer-assisted video interviewing for longitudinal surveys?
That's a very good and very big question. Where to start? So certainly in the UK context, where we have several major longitudinal surveys that are primarily face-to-face, or at least use quite a lot of face-to-face interviewing, or did do until 18 months ago. And as you say, I mean, those had to rapidly take a decision to use different modes of data collection, or not carry out the next wave of data collection until things had stabilized somewhat. In the case of Understanding Society, the study that I'm co-investigator on, that was almost entirely a face-to-face survey for many years, but we had already started converting to mixed mode a few years ago. So we already had a mixed mode design where the whole survey was set up to operate as face-to-face or telephone or web. So we had the technical capability to use any of those three already in place. The design prior to 18 months ago involved a large proportion of the sample being issued primarily for face-to-face interviews, and in some cases with a possibility of web at a later stage in the fieldwork, but an increasing proportion of the sample issued initially to web. So it's kind of a push to web design. We tried to get as many people as possible to do it online, and then we were mopping up the non-respondents with face-to-face interviewing. So the proportion of face-to-face interviews was going down year on year. Now, the fact that we already had this all set up as a mixed mode survey put us in a strong position. We were able to quite rapidly transition to a survey where everyone was approached web first from March last year with telephone follow-up. So telephone suddenly became an important part of our mode mix, which it hadn't been before. It had been used for a tiny proportion of non-respondents as a kind of last resort mode. So we ended up, in our case, not having any real discontinuity in the data collection, which was important because we have continuous field work with new sample going in the field every month. But having a sudden change in mode for quite a lot of sample members, and having some, as yet still not entirely understood, effects on participation. Participation initially after this change in mode was very good, but obviously that was in very strange pandemic circumstances when a lot of people are probably just quite happy to have somebody contacting them, asking them some questions. That wore off after a month or two, and then it looks like we took a little bit of a response rate hit for a few months. Your question about what's going to happen when we go back to face-to-face, I mean, we don't really know yet whether these people who we've clearly lost some of them last year who might otherwise have responded, whether they're going to come back next year when we hopefully can approach them face-to-face or not. We don't yet know, but I mean, the plan is to return to face-to-face interviewing from January for the waves that starts then. We shall see. Other longitudinal surveys other than ours have indeed been experimenting with video interviewing, for example. Just heard a conference presentation on that very topic earlier this afternoon. And that seems to be, quite successful. I mean, I've seen several surveys that have either experimented with using it or actually implemented it. And the uptake rate and the kind of way it's done seems to vary enormously, but it clearly can be very successful in some contexts. I've probably said far too much, so I'll stop there and let somebody else ask a question.
Any comments on the discussion so far, or does anybody have a different question to ask?
I can ask a question. So
go ahead. Thank you.
One of my concerns always with longitudinal studies is the non-response is quite different than, say, cross-sectional, because you've got people who have already participated, have already agreed, and with the cross-sectional, of course, it's very hard to get people to do any. This people will never do surveys, but it seems to me that the non-response in longitudinal is often tied to the reason you're following in them, which creates a lot of bias. So I was curious if you have any thoughts on how to reduce bias, particularly because in a longitudinal study, the reason why you might not want to fill it out is you kind of expect what's coming in. You kind of feel already about why they're following you.
Yeah, no, very good points. So certainly one of the big differences, as I think you alluded to in terms of non-response on a longitudinal study, is that once you've taken part once you got past the first wave, as you say, the respondents know exactly what taking part in the survey is like. They've experienced the questions. They know whether they found it difficult or sensitive or embarrassing or whatever. Normally, when you just ask them to take part in a cross-sectional survey, they just have a very kind of vague heuristic sense of what's about to happen if they take part in a survey interview. But now they know exactly what's going to happen. So it's quite likely, as you say, that some of the subsequent dropout is more the content of the survey. On the other hand, the upside is that once you've got past that first interview, you know an awful lot about your sample members. You've already collected a whole interview's worth of data from them. And for big longitudinal surveys, that's often a lot of data. These are often quite long, involved interviews. So at least you know a lot about the nature of the bias. Yes, you may have bias to drop out, but you can correct for it in the sense that you can use all your previous wave data as auxiliary variables for weighting, for modeling, for imputation, whatever you want to do. So that does actually put a little bit more onus on those adjustment methods, I think, in the longitudinal survey context, because you do need to make the adjustment, but you can, because you can to an extent, because you've got a lot of this data. And you need to find the best ways to use that information to make the adjustment to ensure that your results are as unbiased as possible. It's never possible to completely remove non-response bias, but you're at least in a pretty strong position usually with longitudinal surveys.
Okay, we have a question from Ali Sue. Ali Sue, would you like to go ahead?
Hi, yes. Hi, Peter. I just wanted to contribute to the prior discussion and maybe, mostly for Darby's benefit, but even though it's dated quite a bit, it's a couple, few decades old experience. On the NLS 79 cohort, we had a round, the 9th round of the study, where the BLS, the sponsor, had wanted to save cost. And so we had a transition to a telephone round with some field follow-up. But the result was such a hit on the response rate that BLS decided to go back to face-to-face. And we were able the following year and subsequently to go back to the incredibly high response face-to-face rates that we had back then. So it is possible to go back, to your sample and rechange to face-to-face successfully. Thank you.
Thanks, Ali Sue. And if anyone else has any experiences to share, do just chip in. One thing I perhaps could have mentioned in my response to Darby is that there was a special issue of the journal Survey Research Methods last year, all about, about a couple of related things, one of which was the effect of the pandemic on survey methods. The other was about surveys informing research about the pandemic. That special issue may have some papers in it of interest to some of you.
Hugh, did you want to go ahead?
Yeah, I'm afraid I'm not a government statistician anymore. I work in data science, but I was just interested in the dissemination of the work and whether Wiley were keen for contributors to create code or some kind of in the world of data science now. There's a huge culture of disseminating new ideas through short articles with example code, so that people can very quickly replicate results and demo things. Often it's in Python or in Scala, but people can then within 15 minutes replicate what an academic has described in a longer journal paper. And I just wondered, in the world of government statistics or longitudinal surveys, is there a push from publishers like Wiley to get people to sort of disseminate in those ways through websites like Medium and so on?
Yeah, so I kind of feel the answer is yes and no. There is quite a push for dissemination of the kind you talk about. I don't feel that it's coming so much from publishers, except for some of the newer, more innovative ones, not from old established publishers like Wiley. It's coming a lot from funders. Funders often now insist that you need to provide open access to your coding and your methods and whatever for any research that they have funded. So that affects a lot of the ways that people publish their research in journals, for example. In the case of this book, I mean, the book does have an associated website where Wiley encouraged chapter authors to add additional material, which could be code, it could be additional tables, additional analysis, whatever. And not all authors took up that offer. Some were unwilling to provide anything additional. Some have provided quite useful additional things, but it's a very static additional website. It just has the material there that authors have submitted. There's no interaction. You can't comment. Authors can't follow up with additional material and so on. So there are different ways of doing it. And, you know, the method used with this book, as I said, is sort of certainly not the most innovative and most flexible.
Thank you.
Alexandria, did you have a question you wanted to ask?
Yes, thank you all for hosting. Just getting started and learning in the field, wanted to know if there were any guidance or reference materials on item development and refining existing items in longitudinal surveys.
Well, that's another big area. I guess, I mean, the obvious starting point is to say that often a big debate that is had on many longitudinal surveys is how you best define when or whether it is best to try and refine and improve your survey items, because there's a trade-off. The whole point of longitudinal surveys is largely to measure change and stability over time, and to do that well, you need to ask exactly the same items each time, the same questions. So there's a big kind of motivation for not improving your items. Right? You want to keep them the same, but on the other hand, at some point, if they're just not working very well, or things have changed in the real world, so that the meaning of the question has changed or whatever, then you have to change them. So that's really actually the biggest question, is when to try and improve your questions rather than how to do it. I think the how to do it is quite a general question that would apply to any kind of survey question development. There's not a lot that's hugely different about a longitudinal survey, although one difference is you do have an available large pool of respondents who have been answering those questions in the past, whose experience of doing so you might want to tap into. I'm sure that others can say more than I have about methods for developing and testing good survey questions.
Any other questions? Actually, I have a comment, Peter, and you know, this might be a really dumb question, but it's an area that I've been interested in. You touched on it earlier about your kind of keeping in touch, or rather, you know, encouraging respondents to keep in touch with you. And I think, you know, many years ago, the emphasis was very much on the survey researchers keeping in touch with the respondents. I'd be interested to know kind of what methods, or what kind of new methods or new techniques you have to encourage respondents to stay interested and in touch with you.
So yeah, I mean, you're right. I alluded to that, and there is some discussion of that, but in the chapter by Lisa Calderwood and colleagues in the book. A lot of longitudinal surveys now have some kind of online participant portal where sample members can do various things, which might be very different from one study to another. As an absolute minimum, it's usually a way that they can communicate with the survey researchers to provide feedback on the experience of each survey, or to notify of change of contact details, or hopefully not to notify that they don't want to take part anymore, that kind of thing. But often these portals are far more sophisticated than that. And in some cases, they involve getting the respondents to get engaged in doing other activities, including communicating with one another. Some might think that's not necessarily always a good idea, but there are certainly a range of different ways in which studies try to keep respondents as engaged as possible. Again, I mean, I'm sure there are many other people here amongst the participants who have experience of doing this and might be able to tell us what you're doing.
Does anybody have some experience or something to share with that? Sarah, was your question related to that, or Jason? Sarah?
Yeah, I was wondering if you could talk about best practices for the other end of having too little response. I've worked in cases where it was a longitudinal study in a poor context, so people really wanted to get the incentives, and so looking across waves, it's like, oh, their gender changed, their age increased by way more than 2 years, etc. And I was wondering if you had any insights on practices to prevent that, as well as quality checks once you have the data collected.
Yeah, I'm not sure that I do. I see the issue. Certainly ways of trying to ensure that the people taking part are the people who we want to take part are important, and they're generally more important for self-completion surveys than face-to-face. It's much easier for an interviewer in a face-to-face survey to kind of verify that they're talking to the right person. Telephone's kind of somewhere in the middle, I guess. These issues often arise in slightly different contexts, which is like where you're recruiting a new sample, and particularly if it's a household sample and you want everyone in the household to participate, then clearly if you're giving an incentive per person, there's a motivation for some people to invent extra household members just to get a bigger incentive. So you do need to try, quite hard to come up with quality checks that are going to at least detect that. You can't really stop it happening, but you can at least detect it to a large extent once it's happened and try to rectify it. I think what we don't ever do in that situation is to try to reclaim incentives from people. That's just part of the deal. That's part of what's happened. Okay, we've lost that, fine. Similarly, on longitudinal surveys, you sometimes get people who claim they haven't received their incentive and can please send it again. And you often wonder how many of them didn't receive it, or are they just trying it on and they want another one? That's fine. It's a longitudinal survey. These people are valuable to us, so we just live with it. We send them an incentive. We don't question it. Yeah, but again, I mean, there are lots of experts here in the participants, and other people may have more experience of this.
Jason, did you want to go ahead? Jason, did you want to ask you? I think you're muted. I don't hear you. If you want to type your question in the chat, I could read it out. Okay. In the meantime, does anyone else have a comment or anything they'd like to say?
Well, I
have
can
another.
Oh, sorry.
Jason Fields, just.
Yep. Hi, Amanda.
Another Jason.
Yep. Thanks. I figured since one Jason, maybe another would work. So, hi, Peter. Thanks very much for coming to talk to us. So I'm wondering if there's maybe another chapter that we'll end up having to have. I'm engaging the National Academy's CN Stat panel to have a consensus volume put together and think about how we maintain privacy for our respondents in longitudinal surveys and how we protect our data. It's getting harder and harder to collect and release data. What you just, I know we don't have any good answers at the moment, but things are getting talked about, like synthetic data, like suppressing things, but longitudinal data is really hard to protect because you really want to provide for the ability to have scientific discovery now and down the road, right? We're protecting for relationships we may not know yet. So I guess my question really is, where do you think we need to go in the field with our longitudinal data products and data collections?
That's a really good question, Jason. I think you're absolutely right. So what we need probably at the moment is a kind of stock taking of where we are, what the issues are, what we know, and what we should be trying to develop as methods for the future. Because as you say, the issues are more complex in several ways on a longitudinal survey. I mean, it's partly the what you don't yet know that you're going to collect in the future. It's often partly just that you have such a richness of data over time that when you put it all together, you're more and more likely to come up with a set of answers that makes somebody relatively unique and therefore identifiable than if you just look at one wave of data at a time. So some of our standard methods for assessing identifiability of sample members really need to deal with that, at the outset with some kind of prediction of what's going to happen, of knowing what you're going to be collecting repeatedly and so on. So I think there are a lot of issues that we don't really know how to best handle at the moment. And a good starting point would be just to try and set those out. So maybe we need some kind of symposium that ends up with a monograph volume doing just that as a good starting point.
Yeah. I think so, and I'm hoping that we get kind of a kickoff in that direction from this CN Stat panel. But I would encourage us to maybe put this one on the radar for thinking about down the road.
Yeah, agreed.
I have a related question / comment, which is, what do you think about how to balance, especially in a longitudinal survey, especially with record linkage where respondents need to consent, the balance between, assuring them that their data will be protected and providing them with information about how it'll be used, and especially how it will be used in the future when you don't know how it will be used in the future, balancing that with not wanting to scare people off or burden them with extremely long consent forms and consent processes.
Yeah, another really good question. And actually, my colleague Annette Yekler at Essex is currently leading a tranche of research on data consent in a longitudinal context. It's trying to look at some of those issues. She's much more expert in this particular issue than I am. Yeah, it's very difficult getting the balance. One thing that I think is very clear from the existing research is that providing more specific, detailed information so that the consent in theory becomes more informed may actually lead to it being less likely that the sample member will actually read the information and pay attention to it, and more likely that they will say, well, look, this is just too much for me to engage with, and therefore they don't give consent. So, that's clear, but it doesn't really give us clear guidance of where to strike this balance. What information should we provide that actually doesn't put too many people off from providing the consent. But the other issues are really about also about what exactly people are consenting to, because often in a longitudinal survey, you want the linked data to be longitudinal as well. You're not trying to link, one moment in time administrative data to a longitudinal survey. That's of rather limited use. You want to have the longitudinal administrative data, so you want to be linking regularly over time. And therefore the nature of what you're linking changes and increases in content and volume over time. So can you ask people to consent to linkage taking place indefinitely, or can you ask for a particular period of time and then you have to ask again? Or what is the best way of doing this in a way that again gives you this right balance between asking them every single wave or every 6 months or whatever it might be, which is clearly not going to give you a high proportion of people consenting every time. Getting that right is really tricky. So I think this is another of those areas where we don't really know enough about what best practice is.
Jason, you think you've got your mic working now? Do you want to give it a go?
I can tell you haven't. Can't hear you.
Okay, I don't know if everyone can see Jason's comment in the chat. If you want me to read it out. I'm not sure there's a question necessarily, but it's an interesting discussion point.
Yes, I guess this was a comment relating to the earlier discussion about participant engagement and what different surveys do. So that's a nice example. What you also see in the chat is my colleague John Burton has posted a link to Annette Jeckler's research project on consent that I mentioned. So anyone interested in that topic, have a look and see what's on that webpage.
Thank you. And I think we've got time for one more question. We have Kristen Sibeli. Do you want to go ahead?
Oh, hi. Okay, thank you so much. Peter, it's great to hear you in person. I've read your work, but I've never heard you speak before. My name's Kristen Sibeli-Hibben, and I hope this isn't coming out of left field, but I was recently part of a task force on 3MC surveys, so comparative surveys with Lars Leiberg and Beth Allen Pennell. And others who were actually part of this meeting as well were on the task force. And I was just curious if there were any chapters in this volume that address cross-national or cross-cultural comparability in the context of longitudinal surveys. I said I hope it isn't coming out of left field because I remember in the task force report that we cited a thought piece of yours on comparative surveys that was back from 2006. So anyway, any thoughts you have on the subject of, the intersection between comparability and longitudinal surveys would be really interesting.
Yeah, thanks. It's good to hear your voice too, Kristen. I don't think I've ever spoken to you before, though I have read some of your work, including the task force report.
Oh, awesome.
Yeah, no, it's right. When you started talking, I started thinking of this presentation I gave at the very first ESRA conference, which is probably the one you're referring to, which is about comparative longitudinal surveys, and it was very much a thought piece. No is a short answer. There isn't any chapter on that in the book. Neither was there in the earlier book. There's nothing about explicitly cross-nationally comparative surveys. It's worth just saying that there are not many explicitly cross-national comparative longitudinal surveys. There are extremely few, and that's probably why there's not much written about them. What there are is some kind of similar surveys that are carried out in multiple countries, some of which have made attempts to kind of post hoc harmonize and to produce cross-national data files from surveys that were not initially, pre-fieldwork harmonized. So there are initiatives of that kind, certainly with household panel surveys and with birth cohort surveys and one or two other types of surveys. But no, I think it's a topic that desperately needs something serious to be written about it.
Maybe for the next volume.
Maybe.
Thank you so much.
Well, I'm going to say a huge thank you to Professor Lynn for being willing to kick off this series and in such a fantastic fashion. I really appreciate your time and everybody else's time today in coming along and joining us. I'm going to hand over to Andy, who's going to announce the book winner. So Andy, do you want to tell us who has won Peter's book today?
Yeah, it's Alexandria Williams. So we'll get in touch and send a copy of the book to you. Thank you. And thanks everyone for attending and Peter for the great talk today and great conversation. I also want to let folks know that we're going to have our next book event will be Laura Wilson and Emmett Dickinson's a new book called Respondent-Centered Surveys, Stop, Listen, and Then Design. So watch for details on that coming out soon. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and I hope you all have a lovely afternoon. All the best. See you
Thanks,
soon.
Amanda.
Bye.